Good afternoon and good morning to everyone. This is the last side event in almost the last day of the ASP. Tomorrow it will close, concerning the reforming national nomination procedure for ICC Judicial candidate. It is a side event organized by the Parliamentarians for Global Action and hosted by three very important governments taking a lead in this area at the Assembly of State Parties. I'm referring to the government of Switzerland, New Zealand, and Liechtenstein. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Roughton, who's joining us from New York, and we really thank him for waking up so early. Luke is the legal advisor of the permanent mission of New Zealand to the United Nations, but most importantly, he has the role of being the facilitator on review of the procedure for the nomination election of the judges within the framework of the Assembly of State Parties and its New York working group. And in the preparation of this event, when I was talking to any of our participants, stakeholders, friends, the first comment was, have you invited Luke Roughton? So I think he has the right to speak first by universal acclamation. Luke, I'm honored to give you the floor.
Thank you so much, David, for that kind introduction. And let me begin by thanking Parliamentarians for Global Action for convening this event, which New Zealand is very pleased to co-sponsor, along with Switzerland and Liechtenstein. And thank you so much for inviting me to provide some opening remarks in my capacity as facilitator of the ASP's review of the procedure for the nomination and election of judges. There's an incredible lineup of speakers for this event, and so I don't want to take up too much time. So I will limit myself to just a few remarks made in my personal capacity, mainly to contextualize the work of the ASP in the New York Working Group on this topic. Those contextual remarks won't be a repetition of the kind of dry report of the facilitation that was produced to the ASP. That has all the detail. So I do recommend you read that if you're interested in the blow-by-blow meeting analysis of the work over the year. I would say that there has been a growing acknowledgement of the importance of national nomination procedures to an effective ICC judiciary over the last few years. And certainly that's in no small part because of the efforts of civil society. I think this has also coincided with a more general desire to review and improve the functioning of the court as a whole, which of course resulted in the mandating of the independent expert review of the court. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Justice Goldstone later. These two factors in my mind coalesced ahead of the 18th session of the ASP in 2019 and resulted that year, I think, in a good deal of political will amongst states parties to improve the procedure for the nomination and election of judges at that session in time for the judicial elections that would take place at the following session. So following negotiations at the New York Working Group, the 18th ASP did make changes to the procedure for the nomination and election of judges, and many of these were focused on national nomination procedures rather than election procedures. I think this followed an understanding that as much as politics can interfere with purely merit-based voting decisions, this becomes less of a factor when national nomination procedures ensure that all candidates are of the highest quality. So the action taken in 2019 was intended to be the beginning of an ongoing review of the procedure for the nomination and election of judges, certainly not an end point. Many proposals were made that year which received broad support, but not consensus, in the limited time we had to negotiate the resolution. I think in the end, we only had 18 days to negotiate the resolution that year. So the New York Working Group recommended continued consideration of those proposals. The work of the New York Working Group on this topic in 2020 focused more narrowly on the modalities for the public roundtables with judicial candidates. I think that's a factor of both the pandemic, which caught us by surprise, and also the fact that it was an election year. But fortunately, the IER was taking that time to look closely at these issues and provided 10 recommendations in relation to the nomination and election of judges. I have a few reflections from the work of the facilitation this year as we've begun the consideration of these recommendations. The first is that overall, in my assessment, there is broad support for the content of and intent behind many of the recommendations. Many, though not all, of the recommendations mirror or expand upon proposals that had previously been made by civil society or states parties, but which had not yet obtained consensus support in the New York Working Group. Just as an example, the recommendation to explore criteria and guidelines for the conduct of national nomination procedures could be seen, though there is disagreement on this, as a step which logically follows the ASP's 2019 invitation for states to share their national procedures and for the ACN to prepare a reference document of good practices. And that's just one example. Those who followed the work of the facilitation this year will know that this broad support translated to specific proposals to implement many of the recommendations, although in the end it became clear that we would not be in a position to implement them at this ASP for lack of consensus and for running out of time. The second reflection I would add is that despite the process of the review of nomination procedures being kicked off in 2019, and despite the receipt of the IER recommendations which fit nicely with that process, I think overall there was less engagement on this issue in 2021 than there has been in previous years. In my view, and from conversations I've had with delegations, this is not a symptom of declining interest or diminished recognition of the importance of the issues by states parties, but rather a question of capacity and the attention of delegations being divided across multiple important work streams, including beyond the ICC this year. But my final reflection is that there is cause for optimism. Even though we were not able to achieve consensus on the implementation of any of the IER recommendations this year, there is a strong desire to continue the consideration of them and for this work to be picked up early in 2022. This is what the New York Working Group has recommended and what the ASP will mandate at this session. So let me conclude by saying that the more nominating states are brought to understand that the quality of both judicial candidates and of the nomination procedures leading to their candidatures are important considerations for states parties when deciding who to vote for, the more likely it is that the quality of both will be lifted. For this reason, I can only commend the attention that the co-sponsors of this event, particularly PGA, are bringing to the issue and to encourage more of it throughout the months to come. I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luke. And if I can add a very minor comment to your perfect presentation, I think because 2021 is not really an election year, then the attention is a little bit lower. As we go closer to an election year, which is 2023, so 2022, you will have to decide what to do during the election year. Then I think the level of attention, of course, will naturally, hopefully, increase. But you gave really a comprehensive consideration of the topic. You contextualized it. So let me just say, where does the attention from PGA comes from? And then I give the floor to Justice Richard Goldstone. It comes from our board of elected parliamentarians. And they reacted in June 2018 in a board meeting, the day of the Bemba appeals decision on acquittal, where they then confronted with me about the need, in their view, to criticize the court because they were utterly disheartened by these 3-2 decision reverting on a very important appeals judgment of the court. And I made an enormous effort, successful in the end, to ask them not to do so, because one day you criticize a judgment for a right reason, the next day you do it for the wrong one. And parliamentarians should always indicate to their constituencies that the rule of law applies whether you like it or not, a judicial determination by an independent court. But this really reinforced our priority that certain, and the problem was not only the acquittal in itself is not the problem, because in a court of law, in the criminal court, people, indicted person can be convicted or acquitted beyond reasonable doubt, because there is the decision taken by the independent judges. The problem was the reasoning. The problem was the content, was why was he acquitted? Based on an interpretation of Article 28 on command responsibility that is absolutely unprecedented, with 2 different views by one judge on one side and 2 other judges on the other side, whereby the minority opinion was absolutely convincing from a legal standing. the one co-signed by the current president of the court, Judge Hofmansky. So we were there really speechless, and then we reinforced really our campaign towards this aspect of the quality of the judges that the court should have. In this framework, we were delighted to see that the independent expert review was created. Here I want to pay a tribute especially to my colleagues from Human Rights Watch, because they've been the lead in the civil society movements towards this exercise, together with others, of course. And I think the fact that Justice Goldstone was appointed chair of that committee that group made it really a very credible one. Justice Goldstone was the first prosecutor in the ICTY and ICTR, and led the office of the prosecutor at those very challenging times to incredibly significant results. And there is no law book that is studied by public international law students that doesn't mention the Tadic case. And Tadic was not Milosevic, was not Bashir, was really, but the quality of the materials that the prosecutor and the judges under the leadership of Professor Cassese put together made that the most cited judgment in international criminal law after Nuremberg. So here we are, 20 years after the ICC has been established. I cannot say the same for any single judgment issued by the ICC. Justice Goldstone, you added, together with your independent expert review group, these chapters 20 to the report that you issued on the 30th of September 2020. So I'm really delighted to give you the floor to give us a presentation about the important work that you have made. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, David, for that very kind introduction. And I would also add my thanks to PGA for having arranged this discussion on a very important topic of nomination procedures for ICC judicial candidates. I hardly need convince this audience of the crucial role played by judges in any system of justice. Their competence and their independence are the foundation on which the success and public trust in the system are built. That trust, if anything, is even more important for the credibility of an international criminal court. Before the relative successes of the ad hoc and hybrid tribunals, many supporters of such courts harbored doubts as to whether judges from the four corners of our world, each with their own systems of substantive and procedural law, could get together and conduct efficient and, above all, fair trials. By and large, they did so. And today, it is no longer questioned that international criminal tribunals are able to conduct efficient and fair trials. That's almost now taken for granted. It was an essential development that led to the Rome Statute and the establishment of the International Criminal Court. When the ASP established the Independent Expert Review of the ICC, the IER, at the end of 2019, the issues that were referred to the IER were set out in detail. Some other issues were already under review by other sub-organs of the ASP. So the New York Working Group had already been seized with the question of the nomination and election of judges. However, and perhaps fortunately, the IER was expressly authorized by the ASP to add to the issues expressly referred to it. It did so in very few cases, and none of them was as important as the system of nomination of judges. In its final report of the 30th of September of 2000, the IER referred to the questions that had arisen over some years concerning the competence and the suitability of some of the judges of the ICC. It explained that for that reason, I quote, it was considered impossible to say that the expert's review was complete without looking at the method by which judges are appointed to see whether measures to improve the process could be identified with a view to ensuring the appointment of the best candidates. We were informed by credible witnesses that the ability and experience of some of the judges who have been elected has not marked them out as judges or jurists of the highest caliber sought by the court. The IER went on to state that the belief persists that some judges have owed their success in the ballot more to electoral horse trading than competence. As stated in the report, that was also consistent with the personal experience of some of the experts themselves of campaigning and voting practices surrounding the UN elections that they have been involved in. At their assembly in December 2019, the states parties passed a resolution on the review of the procedure for the nomination and election of judges. That resolution, I quote, encourages states parties to refrain from the trading of votes, unquote. The experts comment in their report on this phrase, that states parties are encouraged to refrain from trading of votes, was that it bears the appearance of an aspirational statement made by some well-meaning outside observer. That practice, we said, should have been outlawed in the strongest terms by the ASP. This is an issue in respect to which the Assembly should be firm and uncompromising. This rather weak approach of deferring to states parties regarding the nomination process was continued in the resolution adopted by the ASP yesterday. I will return to that presently. The responsibility for making appropriate judicial appointments to the ICC lies jointly with the states parties themselves and the Assembly of States Parties. There is too frequently the political self-interest of states parties on the one hand, and a line of least resistance taken by the ASP on the other. In order to assist it make appropriate appointments, the ASP in 2011 established the Advisory Committee on Nominations. That committee was mandated by the ASP to facilitate that the highest qualified individuals are appointed as judges of the ICC. I would dare to suggest that had this committee been part of the original architecture of the court, some of the unfortunate early appointments might well have been avoided. As the IER pointed out, if the individuals nominated by states parties are of the highest caliber, it would not matter which of them might be elected by the ASP. All of them would be qualified. They would by definition have the skills necessary to conduct a mass atrocities trial of a complex nature over a number of years, both fairly and expeditiously. Whether the List A judges of people with judicial experience, the List A judges are formally qualified, will usually appear from the curriculum vitae. However, a candidate who falls within List B may be an academic or diplomat or an experienced legal professional in some other field of law. Such a candidate is required by the Rome Statute to have extensive experience in a professional legal capacity which is relevant to the judicial work of the court. As the IER also pointed out, a candidate who relies on experience in such areas should, other than in an exceptional case, be required to demonstrate the skills necessary to conduct a complex war crimes trial. Together with many other commentators on the ICC, the IER suggested that consideration be given to abandoning List B candidates. They do not include judicial experience as a requirement. List B judges have more often than not been appointed to pre-trial and trial courts, where practical judicial skills are crucial. The IER made 10 recommendations to the ASP regarding the procedure for nomination of judicial candidates. Having regard to the large number of recommendations made in the final report, some 384 of them, the IER considered that it would be helpful to the ASP if it were to provide a list of those recommendations that should be prioritized. That list is contained in Annex 1 to the final IER report. The recommendations relating to the nominations of judges, the 10 recommendations, are all included in the priority list. That list has been used by the review mechanism that has been established by the ASP to manage and consider the findings and recommendations of the IER. The review mechanism, may I say, has performed sterling work in its analysis of and responses to the IER recommendation. This appears from its most recent report to the ASP. At this week's ASP meeting, the review mechanism was justifiably commended by many states parties on the work that it has performed. The recommendations regarding the nomination of judges were referred by the review mechanism to the New York Working Group, which, as I've already mentioned, has been seized for some years with this topic. On Tuesday of this week, the New York Working Group published its latest report to the ASP, in which it refers to its members' views relating to the recommendations made by the IER. Perhaps one of the most important recommendations that we made is that the ASP should aim to harmonize the national procedures for nominating candidates. Roughton has already referred to this recommendation. As the next nomination period for the appointment of 6 new judges will commence in a little more than a year from now, the IER suggested that states parties should provide information and commentary on their nomination procedures in the course of 2021. For the last 2 years, the Advisory Committee on Nominations of Judges has received submissions from a number of states parties on their nomination procedures. The Advisory Committee is expected to produce a reference document based on these submissions. When this document will be published is not clear, but certainly it is to be hoped that it will be during the first half of 2022, and that is the indication given by the New York Working Group. There's an expectation that this reference document would assist states parties that are contemplating revised legislation on nominations. It is worth repeating that if all states parties nominated judges of the experience required by the Rome Statute, the work of the Advisory Committee in electing judges, in nominating judges, would be considerably facilitated. It was recommended by the IER that ahead of the 2023 judicial elections, the Working Group on Nomination and Election of Judges should compile a set of criteria and guidelines to be applied in national nomination processes. The nominating state should submit alongside their nomination a certificate setting out the procedure followed for the nomination. Work on this important recommendation has not been completed. Some states have suggested that harmonization of the nomination process is not feasible. There is more optimism, however, expressed with regard to the criteria to be applied by all states parties. This is a cardinal issue, and again, it is hoped that there will be further progress in the first half of 2022. In 2019, the procedure of the Advisory Committee on Nominations was amended with regard to interviews conducted by the Advisory Committee with nominees. In-person interviews were not made mandatory. The IER has recommended, however, that such interviews should be mandatory, and that if a candidate fails to appear in person, the candidacy, save in exceptional circumstances, should not proceed. The amendments to the Advisory Committee procedures also made provision for a public roundtable with candidates after the committee has made its selection. This event includes representatives of civil society and provides a transparent opportunity for the appraisal of the candidates. The IER supports this procedure and similarly recommended that attendance at the roundtable by the candidate should also be made mandatory, save in exceptional circumstances. In the report of the New York Working Group, it accepted the principle of these recommendations, but noted that some states parties would like to add that virtual participation should be acceptable in certain circumstances. This is reflected in the resolution adopted by the ASP yesterday, where reference is made to the fact that the ASP, quote, stresses the responsibility of nominating states to ensure that the candidates attend an interview with the Advisory Committee on Nominations. I would, with respect, say it is disappointing that the resolution goes on to make it, quote, preferable to have interviews and the roundtable in person or by video conference or similar means, if appropriate. There is no definition in the resolution or precision by what is meant by preferable. or when it would be appropriate to have the interview by video conference rather than in person. There appears to me to be a clear reluctance by the ASP to use the phrase, save in exceptional circumstances. This is unfortunate and will probably lead to future contention with regard to elections. The final recommendation to which I have time to refer appears to be an obvious one. It is that states parties should accord utmost respect to the assessments in the advisory committee report and should not cast their vote in a way that is inconsistent with any aspect of an assessment. As recorded in the IER report in the most recent election of judges in 2020, the advisory committee confined themselves to distinguishing the candidates as either formally qualified or particularly well qualified, a distinction that could leave no fair-minded reader in doubt about which candidates fulfilled the ASP's stated aim of nominating and selecting the most highly qualified judges in accordance with Article 36 of the Rome Statute. In spite of that, at that election, where 6 of the candidates were described as formally qualified and 6 as particularly well qualified, 2 of the formally qualified candidates were elected. That is a matter for regret. The IER also recommended the specific inclusion in the mandate of the advisory committee of the responsibility to report an unsuitable candidate as such. If candidates are regarded as unsuitable, there should be a mandatory obligation on the advisory committee to say that. It could play a major role in enhancing the caliber of the court bench. There does not appear yet to be an agreed response to this recommendation on the respect paid to reports from the advisory committee. In its latest report to the ASP, the New York Working Group recommends that all of the IER recommendations should continue to be considered in 2022. As already mentioned, it recommended that the recommendations on the harmonization and the nomination process should be the subject of consideration early in 2022. It thus appears that some, but I would suggest insufficient progress on moving the nomination progress is being made. I sincerely hope that more rapid progress and agreement will be manifest early next year. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward very much to the discussion on this crucially important topic.
Thank you, Justice Goldstone, and you really gave us a quite in-depth analysis of all the recommendations that the independent expert review made, also linking with previous work done by the New York Working Group. One of our participants asked whether you were reading a written statement. If that speech would be possibly available, we would be very happy to publish it in the PGA website, but we defer to your decision.
I was speaking from notes which I'll be happy to share with you.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you, Justice Goldstone. Without further ado, let me now give the floor to our main host, if I can say so, also because the government of Switzerland is a partner of Parliamentarians for Global Action. And we have today the Deputy Director at the International Law Department of the Swiss Foreign Ministry, Ambassador Nathalie Marti from Bern. I'm really delighted to give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. At the general debate of the ASP this week, the states parties which expressed themselves expressed their commitment to a strong and independent ICC. It's important to follow up with concrete action. State parties to the Rome Statute nominate and elect judges to the court, and as it was said, they have the responsibility to choose only the most qualified person to these key positions. Therefore, improving the national nomination procedures for judicial candidates is paramount to improve the court's effectiveness and efficiency. I would therefore like to thank PGA for organizing the present event. And I'll also thank you all for participating in this today's exchange. and for inviting Switzerland to give you an example of what we've done so far. As a representative of a state party, I will shed some light on how improving the procedure may work in practice. We ourselves went through the process of establishing a national procedure. Last September, Switzerland submitted its commented draft procedure to the Advisory Committee on Nomination of Judges, as requested. In the drafting process, we also took into account good practices at the domestic and international levels. The Swiss draft procedure will now be finalized once we have the processed the ACN's compendium and based on further exchange among state parties. Switzerland is indeed convinced that learning from each other will help state parties improving their national procedures. This exchange needs to take place by the very beginning of next year to be implemented in time for the next judicial elections in 2023. By submitting its draft procedure, Switzerland hopes to actively contribute to this exchange. Indeed, the Swiss government made supporting an effective ICC a priority of our foreign policy. Within this context, our focus is ensuring that only the most qualified individuals are nominated and elected to high offices of the court. For example, in February 2020, together with Uruguay and Open Society Justice Initiative, we organized a workshop on this topic. One outcome was the practical toolkit. It serves state parties in establishing or improving the respective nomination procedures. We also organized a side event on this issue during the 19th ASP. Against that background, we are glad to participate in the exchange today, and I will share with you the main elements of our present draft procedures, highlighting questions we pose ourselves. I hope on one side that this may nourish the reflection of other states parties, which are in the process or considering to establish a procedure as well. And on the other side, I would look forward to receiving comments from your part, which would help us in the finalization of our procedure. I'd like to develop a few points. First, how do we make sure that the selection process is open and transparent? To achieve this, we are foreseeing in Switzerland to disseminate the job advertisement widely. We would advertise the call publicly and reach out to professional associations, universities, NGOs, and judicial institutions in Switzerland and abroad. My second point, which nomination criteria should form the basis for assessment of candidates? We will, of course, respect the election criteria provided for in the Rome Statute. And nevertheless, there are still questions on how we interpret the statute and whether to set additional criteria. Let me give you some example of criteria we are now including in our draft procedure. Candidates are required to possess significant knowledge and experience in criminal law and procedure. We specify that judicial candidates should hold a law degree and have at least 10 years of experience in the relevant field of law. They should have experience in managing complex criminal trials, including in politically charged environments. Another criteria are the interpersonal skills and soft skills, which are equally important. Candidates should demonstrate us their ability and interest to work in a collegial body where peers of different nationalities from different legal systems are working together. Another criterion, according to the Rome Statute, state parties may nominate candidates who are national of other state parties. Only 10 states have nominated half of all ICC judges. There is a need to ensure a broader pool of competitive candidates that more fully reflect the breadth of the ICC's membership. In Switzerland, we are considering nominated candidates from states that may have refrained from putting candidates forward. In our procedure, candidates are first not required to hold Swiss nationality. Final criteria I'd like to underline: we have a domestic rule on the age of judges at the highest court of Switzerland. We will apply this to the ICC nomination procedure as well. As a consequence, judges should not be older than 59 at the time of nomination. They would then leave office at the end of the year, in which they reach the age of 68 at the latest. That was my second point, the nomination criteria. Now my third point, we would establish a panel which would conduct interviews, tests, and vetting. We were wondering how we could ensure the independence of the panel. We came up with a system where only 2 members would come from the government and at least 5 from outside. The interviews and examinations would be based on objective criteria, including those I referred earlier. It would be on a 2-tier process. The panel would assess the applications and formulate a recommendation to a second entity or Minister of Foreign Affairs who would make the decision. Fourth point, as within the ASP, we were asking ourselves how to conduct the vetting. We foresee requiring candidates to submit criminal records as part of their application, and the panel may check the candidates' references and any other information publicly available with due regard to the credibility of the sources. The panel may also create a standard declaration for all candidates. It would clarify whether they are aware of any allegations of misconduct, including sexual harassment. Where appropriate, the panel may receive comments from outside bodies, including civil society. It may resort to an existing procedure or mechanism within the Swiss system or to a specialized company. Let me conclude. I hope that there will be many state parties joining in drafting or submitting the nomination procedure. I also hope that the questions I have just shared with you might nourish the reflection of other state parties. Above all, Switzerland will look forward to exchanging further with state parties and civil society. We would appreciate receiving any comments, which would help us, as I said before, in finalizing our procedure. Let me already thank you for your valuable contributions to this event. We will follow them closely and are keen on learning more today. We are also impatient to engage more broadly with as many state parties as possible in order to improve nomination procedures and strengthen the ICC. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I failed to say how important it is in your government, the consideration of international humanitarian law. As in Geneva, you house the homes to the Geneva Conventions and to the main bodies that are being the protective authority for those conventions. And yes, it is a surprise that a powerful country in the field of law, as Switzerland is, hasn't yet provided us with a judge at the ICC. But I understand that the dynamics of the nomination and election probably discouraged some countries like yours, like maybe others, to come forward with a name, because as Justice Goldstone said, these quite unprecedented ASP resolution asking states, prohibiting states to do the horse trading, the exchange of votes, which is a practice at the UN. We know that it is, probably was one of the extreme measures that were undertaken by the majority of the states against a practice that maybe the bigger states are able to carry out better than maybe those who are smaller. So in any case, I think these considerations will leave us an important debate. And I want to especially stress two elements of your proposal. Number one, the publicity, the transparency. I think giving transparency to the process of nomination, in my view, addresses 50% of the problems. Because what we have seen is judges being appointed politically by people they knew in the government, in cabinet, and bypassing any sort of public or open procedure for selection, for nomination. And number two, your openness, Ambassador, to receive comments also from civil society. We truly appreciate that. And we will not refrain from giving you the comments. I think you have an excellent proposal, by the way. So I think the comments will also contain a very positive assessment of your proposal, in my humble view. Now we have three voices from civil society. And the first one is our colleague, Liz Evenson, who is the director of advocacy at Human Rights Watch. I hope that Liz can make her camera on from Washington, DC, so very early in the morning. And Liz also has been recently announced as being the new director for the coalition for the ICC. So she's also our, somehow, she's our new boss. So Liz, we are very happy to have you. Please, when we are members of the coalition, of course. So please take the floor.
Thanks very much, David. And I think no one can be your boss, but I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Thank you so much for inviting us to this event and for having this event. Indeed, I don't have too many comments, so much as a couple of questions for the panelists. But I did want to start by saying, as you mentioned, that Human Rights Watch has really championed the independent expert review process as an essential way to work towards the change that we all know is needed to strengthen the ICC's delivery of justice. And we're very grateful to Justice Goldstone for his leadership throughout that process, and to Luke and other assembly mandate holders for the seriousness with which they've pursued the follow-up to the report. It was our worst fear that the report would live only on a shelf somewhere, or perhaps in the advocacy documents of civil society organizations. And as much as we think that there can still be further improvements made in the ongoing process of assessment and implementation, that's clearly not what's happened. The report has become the reference point that we all hoped it would be, around which we can have objective discussions about the recommendations and about the way forward. So really our gratitude to the entire IER panel and to all of the assembly mandate holders that are making this happen. I wanted to just pick up on one additional aspect of the work of the Advisory Committee on Nominations before I pose my questions. And it really relates to what you just mentioned, David, and what you mentioned, Ambassador, about the publicity of the process, the transparency of the process. As you know, within the updated procedures for the Advisory Committee on Nominations, the committee has the possibility to benefit from public information. But as far as we can tell, there's not really a process in place that makes it clear to all stakeholders how to avail themselves of the Advisory Committee on Nominations in order to present information. I think in 2020 that lacuna was bridged in an informal way, in the sense that the Advisory Committee made clear through assembly channels that information could be provided. But you already have to be somewhat, I'd say, in the process, inside the kind of discussions and the community to have realized that that was possible. So what we've advocated to the committee is that they actually set up an online process of some kind to advertise their ability to receive public information and to facilitate that process, which could be modeled on what has happened in other bodies, for example, in the Inter-American Court system, the Inter-American Human Rights system. So that's just one sort of additional thought on the work of the Assembly itself. But on this topic of today, which is really more on the national nominations, and that's clearly, I think, where the focus belongs. I did want to ask all of the speakers, it seems very clear that states parties are quite reluctant to provide information about the national nomination procedures, let alone work on best practices or harmonization. And I'm wondering what more could be done by the Assembly? What are the tools that the Assembly has available to it to compel, for lack of a better word, states parties to be forthcoming? Because again, shining light on these procedures, I think, is part of the way forward here. And then just a second question, if I may, and this one is really more for Justice Goldstone, just taking a broader look at the follow-up to your report. We'd be very interested in your observations about how the assessment is going, the pace of it. Are you surprised to find that states are also part of the assessment on the recommendations directed to the court? Did you anticipate that that would be the case? Has that affected in any way the ability of states parties to focus in on the recommendations that your panel directed to the Assembly? So we'd just be grateful for any observations you have, and even recommendations as to what could be done next year as this process moves forward. But again, thank you so much to all of the co-organizers for the attention to this very important topic.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you for having prepared such a fantastic number of questions to our speakers. I hope they have taken note, because I didn't. So we may ask your help, please. Before giving the floor to Mariana, who is really the expert in this field, I'm very, very delighted to say that we've been joined by the newly elected chairperson of the Trust Fund for the Victims at the ICC, Minu Tavares Mirabal from the Dominican Republic, who had a long, long trip back from The Hague. Good morning, Minu, and we are so proud to have you in a first NGO co-organized event after your re-election. So we are the first, and we are very proud of that. Mariana, you have been leading the team in The Hague of the Open Society Justice Initiative. The Open Society Justice Initiative really has been the leading civil society organization in putting forward publication, research, studies. You took really an issue like vetting at the forefront of the attention of all of us. So no one better than you can bring the conversation forward. Mariana.
Thank you, David, and let me thank Parliamentarians for Global Action and the three co-sponsoring governments for making this event happen. As you said, it's sometimes more difficult to bring the question of elections to the attention of states parties during non-election years, and we believe it's crucial that we sustain attention on elections, because all of the work that goes into improving national nomination processes is really done in between election years. I really want to also acknowledge the leadership of all the three speakers that preceded me. I think you've covered a lot of ground, and I've been delighted to hear each of your presentations to the point that I have little to add. What I wanted to get us back to is, again, why are those nomination processes so important, and why it's important that come beginning of 2022, states parties really focus on the implementation of the IER recommendations on this matter. As David mentioned, my organization, the Open Society Justice Initiative, did research on national nominations, and we've been doing so since 2017. we started doing research because we realized that although national nominations have a key impact on the election process as a whole, because essentially, as it's been said, they determine what the pool of candidates is for the election, there was very little literature on how national nominations unfolded. So we started with research on national nominations for human rights judges and commissioners at regional courts, and we issued a report in 2017. But then we realized that we were missing the ICC. So in 2019, we looked at the election process as a whole. So we looked at the role of the advisory committee nominations. We looked at voting practices. We looked at horse trading. And of course, a crucial part of the report was devoted to national nominations. And what came up in our research is that in a number of countries, there's no legal framework or in other ways, any practice that is established in terms of the way candidates are elected. And that means, as David was saying, that candidates are elected in an ad hoc manner, privileging personal connections at the expense of transparency, competitive opportunity, and merit. In practice, that means that qualified candidates without connections or who do not belong to the political elite or a privileged elite cannot access the system. It also means that the interpretation of whether a candidate meets certain requirements is left to individuals in government with no structure, no checks and balances. And we looked into individual candidates that had successfully been elected, and we found a number of gaps in the assessment of their requirements. Just to give one extreme example, one candidate that was successfully elected as a list A candidate had only 3 years of judicial experience at the time of their election. And there are many more, and that is very unfortunate. And I think here I really want to put my civil society hat and say, this is why this is so important. We cannot continue to have a pool of candidates that do not meet the minimum requirements for a person to be elected to a judicial bench. So as I was saying, although it's important for states to focus on those matters in between election years, we've heard that there's been less attention on this issue over the past year. And that's of course due to a number of other events happening. It's been difficult to sustain attention in negotiations during the pandemic for all of us, also for civil society to follow proceedings. But we really encourage states to focus on those questions come the beginning of 2022. If we push it back first, there won't be enough time to focus on the nomination processes before states are due to nominate, given that based on the past cycle, states will be called to nominate judges in the very beginning of 2023. So really 2022 is the time to improve national nomination procedures. And once we are in 2023, we've noticed that when negotiations happen during an election year, it really becomes very political because states are looking at the candidates that they've been nominated. In many cases, the conversation about national nomination processes turns into bragging about a certain procedure because candidates want to show that their candidate is the one that should be elected. So again, we would have liked to see more progress in 2021, and we really look forward to 2022. Thanks again, PGA and everyone who's spoken at this event.
Thank you, Mariana, and thank you for highlighting once again some of the shortfalls of previously elected candidates. And I think also Judge Goldstone referred to the importance of relevant experience, even though it is a criteria that is listed as such as relevant experience in relevant areas of international law, such as international law and the law of human rights. But we need to restrictively interpret this language relating, for example, to list B, not expansively. This such as means a bit more than an example. It's really the bread and butter of what we need from these 1/3 of judges who come from the public international law dimension of the field of practice of international law. Unfortunately, the interpretation has been, to be honest, too generous, as such as, or can be something else. No, it has to be really relevant, and the language of Article 36 must be interpreted much more strictly. That's our understanding. In this respect, I'm really happy to give the floor to my colleague Frederika Schweighoferova from our own office here in The Hague, who will a bit shed a light on why we are here on behalf of PGA and maybe refer to the experience of other courts and tribunals.
Thank you very much, David. So while there may be not too much to add following these excellent presentations, I would like to offer a different perspective, focusing on the comparative practice of the domestic nomination procedure applied by the European Court of Human Rights, ECHR, established by the Council of Europe, which we have identified as the most relevant benchmark with features of the domestic nominations procedure that could be effectively incorporated, of course, with relevant and necessary modifications in the Rome Statute system. So there are two phases of this election process at the ECHR level. First, the national selection procedure, in which each member state chooses a list of 3 qualified candidates. And then the second part, which is the election procedure undertaken by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, in which the qualifications of the 3 candidates are assessed before the actual elections take place. So as regards the first phase, the national selection procedure, when selecting their 3 candidates, states should ensure that their national procedure is fair and transparent. So they have to issue public and open calls for candidates with the pre-established criteria, which are merit-based for selecting the potential candidates. So for instance, at the ECHR level, this entails that all candidates must have appropriate legal qualifications and experience, and also active knowledge of one of the working languages of the court. So it's English or French with a passive knowledge of the other language. To help ensure that candidates are fully qualified, an international panel of Council of Europe experts offers governments confidential advice on potential candidates before the final list of the 3 is sent to the Assembly. Then moving to the second phase, the election by the Assembly. So once the Assembly receives the list of candidates, a special committee of parliamentarians with legal experience assesses the qualifications of the 3 candidates, which also entails interviews and scrutiny of their CVs. The committee also assesses the fairness of the national selection procedure. So if it finds that all the conditions are met, it draws up a recommendation for the Assembly indicating which of the candidates, perhaps one or more, are the strongest one. And if not, it can even recommend that a state be asked to submit a new list, so rejecting the one that had been provided. And afterwards, the Assembly, which is made up of over 300 parliamentarians, proceeds to vote on the candidates based on the committee's recommendations in a secret ballot during plenary session. It is also important to emphasize the role of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe as they develop a detailed guideline for the member states. So these guidelines include specific recommendations on how to proceed with the election of the candidates, and also an explanatory memorandum containing good practices for each of the action points and phases. So how this could be applicable at the ICC level to ensure transparent and merit-based procedure? So of course, as we have already heard, in the example provided by Ambassador Marti, and we will hear during the next intervention as well, there are already states that apply these criteria and even way beyond those in practice. Nevertheless, we believe that in order to ensure that such domestic procedures are fully followed by all states, they should be explicitly referred to in the Rome Statute. So to this end, PGA prepared a resolution incorporating these criteria already back in 2019, which we have shared with a number of states. This resolution could be transposed into the Rome Statute provisions based on a procedure that I'm going to touch upon later. So the main point of the resolution would make it obligatory for states to publish an open call for applications, which lay down the criteria of eligibility under List A and or List B of Article 36 of the Rome Statute. This should be followed by a thorough and transparent technical assessment as to the qualifications and competences of the candidates, which are supposed to serve as senior judges, so including their abilities to adjudicate complex crimes. A state party that has fulfilled these conditions may submit a proposed nomination of 3 candidates, but of course, in case of countries that, let's say, where the population is maybe less than 5 million, maybe even less, these criteria, of course, could be excluded, and those states could be exempted from this additional burden, perhaps. So, but ideally, in order to ensure that the merit-based and of the process, we would say that 3 candidates would be ideal. But in any case, so this list would be submitted to the Advisory Committee on Nominations at least 4 months before the official term of presentation of judicial candidates. In addition, the selection committee of the state party would produce a ranking list of all the candidates in case there will be more than one that should be delivered to the Advisory Committee on Nominations. So once the committee receives the list with the ranking, it would assess the candidates' qualifications and also the fairness of the procedure. So as such, it would examine whether the state published an open call for applications and whether it applied the pre-established merit-based criteria for selecting the candidates. These, of course, have to be also applied within the ranking system of the candidates. And also the committee should examine whether state took all reasonable measures to avoid any conflict of interest for the nomination of the candidates. This is particularly relevant for the arguments that were also mentioned by Mariana in the intervention before. So, and following such review, the committee could either recognize the validity of the nomination and then select one of the 3 candidates, so if applicable. So this is a bit different in the in comparison with the ECHR system, where it's up to the assembly. Nevertheless, at the ICC level, we believe it would be much more reasonable and feasible to do it already at the level of the committee selection. So they would identify 1 candidate per state. Or it could request state to provide further information regarding the publicity of the call for applications and the application of the criteria. Or it could even reject the proposed nomination and request the state, of course, within a specific time limit, to provide another nomination which will fulfill the procedural and the substantive requirements on the qualifications. So this relates to the substantive part of the reform. As regards the procedure, we believe that the most effective modality of reform entails the modification of the relevant provisions of the Rome Statute, which in this case are Articles 36 and 44. And what is very interesting that is institutional nature of these amendments that we were just speaking about, the reform of the process, they permit the applicability of Article 122 of the statute, according to which their entry into force will take place only 6 months after the adoption of such amendments by a qualified majority of 2/3 of the state's parties within the framework of the ASP. So this is highly relevant because using this procedure for the amendment would significantly expedite the implementation of these provisions into practice. So we could hopefully benefit from the reform in a very expedited manner and very soon. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Frederika. And of course, this is a proposal that PGA made already in 2018. We circulated with a number of governments. I must be honest with you, it didn't attract any attention. But this is just to signal that we can have more than a consensus resolution. There could be a decision by 2/3 of the member states, which includes most of the states that never candidated a single candidate judge, to have something better than we have today in the statute. The alternative would be the way undertaken through the IER report and the work of the New York Working Group, to have a resolution that would guide states towards national nomination procedures that should be fulfilled. If they are only encouraged, no, we are not at the right in the right position. They should be they should be urged, they should be invited. But if they are only encouraged, I think many states will agree to them and then not follow them. So it is, I wanted on behalf of PGA that my colleague Frederika put on the table the work we did back in 2018 following the shock from the Bemba judgment, to then, which was endorsed by our board members. Honorable Petra Bayer is a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe Committee on the Election of Judges, and she's our board member who led the work in this field from the Austrian Parliament. We understand this may be too much, but I think the idea is that also NGOs are providing some sort of very progressive alternatives so that the benchmark for compromise is a bit raised, if that could be considered by states. This leads me to our last speaker before we open the debate, which already leaves open in reality with a number of very pointed questions. And we have, in fact, Minu Tavares Mirabal as the new president of the Trust Fund for the Victims to the Rome Statute. And we all believe in reparative justice, not only punitive justice. So you are part and parcel of the conversation today. But also you have been the leader in the Dominican Republic of Parliamentarians for Global Action, that you also, an organization which you also chaired globally as our international president. And you had an experience in bringing together a consensus, first among parliamentarians, and then with the government official and the committee of, and the judicial community in your country, to nominate probably the most meritorious and respected female judge in your judicial system. So Olga Herrera Carbucha. Minu, I'm really delighted to give you the floor.
Thank you very much, David. And I'm sorry I arrived last night from The Hague, and thanks for your congrats. And I'm really happy to have a few words, share how this experience with you from this side, because I feel at home in PGA, and I'm really glad to share that experience that I think was a previous experience that maybe led PGA to develop this proposal that Frederika just explained, very, very well explained to us. I remember that we were not involved in this. We were working on a parliamentarian workshop related to gender issues and all that, when we knew that there were not candidates presented by our region by that time. And then they decided to extend the period of nominations. And so we said, listen, we need to nominate somebody. Why don't we do it from the Dominican Republic as parliamentarians? The local group of Parliamentarians for Global Action was very, very active by that time. And we started searching for somebody that had the the qualification and that we could nominate. And we, I remember we had a dinner home, and we started asking to a very, very well and notorious lawyer in the Dominican Republic if he knew somebody. And he said, I know, this is an extraordinary judge, but she has two problems. She is she was trying to be elected as a member of the Supreme Court in that moment, and she doesn't speak English, but she does speak French. So I remember that David said, well, it doesn't matter because French is an official language of the court, and it has to be considered like that. And the funny thing is that I had no idea who she was, because she had been a criminal law judge or justice for 31 years. And when I got her name and I was trying to get in touch with her to tell her to apply, I couldn't find her because she was out of the country. But the thing is that every time that I mentioned her, everybody started saying, oh, that's the best justice, the best just we have in the Dominican Republic. So I was really surprised because I couldn't, how come such a person is not known at all? And it was like that. The thing is that we had to convince everybody, because we did not want it as parliamentarians to propose her, but we needed the country to do it. So I went to speak, or we went, because it wasn't only me, the national group of the Dominican parliamentarians to PGA. We went to visit the president of the Dominican Republic. We went to visit the Minister of Foreign Affairs. We went to visit the president of the Supreme Court. And we went to visit the president of the Senate. Everybody came into the campaign. So at the end, she was proposed by all the powers, executive, parliament, judiciary. And she was proposed, and the most difficult thing that we found in that process was to convince her. Because she didn't want it. She said, I am already, it's not serious that I am in the middle of this process trying to be elected member of the Supreme Court, and then I leave it like that and go on and try to be elected in another position, an international position. So it was quite difficult to convince her. And we had to do everything. So we became like, how Frederika called the committee, for nomination, and it's important. I know it is difficult. I know it takes time to convince people in countries like ours, because the criminal court is something that is perceived as being too far from our countries. And but I like to say that the process was really excellent. And I want to say also that I am really proud, because wherever I go in this area of work, like in The Hague or in New York, or I keep receiving recognition for Josh Herrera behavior and work as member of the court during her years there. I was there this last week, and everybody from the ASP to the judiciary, everybody, oh, the drivers from the court, they tell me, oh, wow, you're from the same country as this Herrera, that outstanding lady. So that's why I think she did a very, very outstanding job there. And the thing is, and I think we have to push to keep doing that, is that what we were looking for was for a real criminal judge. We were looking for that. We came to the decision of nominating somebody because the court was full of very, very experienced people, but not in criminal procedures. And she made her goals, and also she did this great job because she had the experience. And I think this is important. And as far as we go on with this project of deciding a national nomination process before one country decides to nominate somebody, it's really important in the way, in the path to strengthen the ICC. It's something really, really important, and I congratulate PGA for doing this, for organizing and putting this organize and structure this process which is pending. And I also thank you for inviting me to share this experience and to let me participate with all of you, with Josh Goldstone, and I also think that this is important, as the IER is also making a proposition on this. So thank you very much, and we will be seeing in the next 3 years in this kind of activities.
Thank you, Minu, also because the role of the judges in the reparation decisions is prominent nowadays as the trials are ending or will be ending. Let me stress that you did all you did many, many years ago because there was no written procedure, because there was no established procedure, because there was not even a guideline towards a nomination procedure. And this brings us back why so many countries didn't have any forward-looking decision to nominate. Also, in this absence of, in this vacuum that the procedure was left over to them. Of course, under list B, there is the procedure for the nomination of the judges to the International Court of Justice, but unfortunately, that procedure has been interpreted differently by different states. So it doesn't really necessarily provide with the guideline we need. Let me now go back to the speakers, as Liz made a number of questions, and I also would like to invite you to make as many comments as you wish. Should I start? Oh, and I see, of course, Valeriane Michel from the Swiss Foreign Ministry Legal Office that would like to take the floor. Valeriane, please.
Thank you so much, David. Can you hear me? So I wish to thank you and your colleagues from PGA, as well as all the distinguished speakers for their interventions. So for those who do not know me, I am Valériane Michel, and I head the section for international humanitarian law and international criminal justice under Ambassador Nathalie Marti, who spoke before. And I wish to thank you especially for convening this event in such a timely manner, because as you were noticing before, there's a bit less of attention this year to the issue. And as Mariana said it very rightly, work is done in between the election year, and that is also where the less political work can be done. And if you count back, having an election in 2023 means, if you want to have chances with your candidate, presenting your candidate at the ASP before, which is already the next ASP. And if you continue counting back, it takes a bit of time to draft and adopt a procedure. There's some procedures that are enshrined in law, for example. So imagine, especially in a country where, like Switzerland, where adopting a law takes so much time, it's quite consuming, meaning that states should start now drafting their procedures to be able then to apply the procedure and be able to present a candidate in time. So that was my first reaction to some of the comments that were made before. And maybe if you allow, David, some thinking on the question by Liz Evenson, which is very relevant, I think, the question of how to compel state parties to be forthcoming. And there, I think the answer is not very straightforward, and I'm looking forward to other contributions on the issue. On my side, I would say I would have 6 ideas, which are not very original. Maybe you have thought of all of them already, but it's good to be thinking together. So the first one is just what Open Society Justice Initiative did. And it's how our work started. They published this research that Mariana talked about before, describing the issues in a very detailed manner and proposing best practices. And that was really the trigger for us, where we realized we're not among the best in class. We don't have a procedure, and it's about time that we start drafting one based on that report. A second element is showing example. So having a procedure, even if you're not thinking about nominating a candidate soon. But it's not only about drafting your procedure for nominating once your candidate, but also during election, when approached by states to vote for their candidates, you can very well use your procedure as a reference to say, well, look, those are our criteria, and we'll base our decision, our voting decision, on that to know whether we'll support your candidate. And Ambassador Marti gave a few of our criteria before: experience, expertise, at least 10 years, age, etc. And those are already very concrete criteria which help you select, make a very short selection of judges for which you can vote for. A third way is what you're doing now, side events to raise awareness. A fourth is more the workshop type of event among states, with possibly external support, to have states work together on what the content needs to be and what's the process. And I can tell you that having gone through the process, it's not very easy to do it. So it's quite useful to be able to exchange with others to do your job. The fifth point would be to approach states bilaterally, especially those who nominate a lot of judges, and to give them advisory work. That's also something that a lot of civil society organizations do, and we thank you for that. And my last point is very much what the ACN is already doing, documenting the national procedure when assessing the candidate. And there the ACN could maybe go into details about the national procedures. So that would be my thoughts on the questions raised before, and I'm looking forward to other thoughts on the same issue. Thank you very much, David, and thank you all.
Thank you, Valeriana. And again, this shows how much work you have been put in this area, which is really leading by example now on this topic. Luke, do you want to comment on the questions or take on some other matters?
Thank you, David. And just briefly, I think the presentations have been excellent. I think with respect to the question, I think we've just heard 6 excellent ideas about how to encourage states or to compel states to provide that information. I would note that in the context of what the ASP and the New York Working Group can do and has done, there was a requirement added to the actual nomination procedures in 2019, so that when states nominate candidates, they have to provide a statement with that nomination, and there's an additional requirement now for them to actually explain what the national nomination procedure is. I would say that there was perhaps mixed implementation of that additional requirement at the previous judicial elections, but perhaps with greater attention placed on that requirement, and I think the twin requirement then of the ACN to also explain whether the nomination procedure that was described was followed in the individual case is one way to incentivize states to provide that information about national nomination procedures. But I suppose, really just to really emphasize that placing attention on the importance of this issue and the idea of states for whom this is an important issue, explaining to other states that this is what will be considered when considering who to cast votes for, is, I think, a really strong incentive for states to actually implement national nomination procedures and to ensure that they are followed. Just with respect to the timing question, yeah, I think, all the reasons that politics enter the election process, those same reasons, or those same politics rather, I think, infiltrate the work of the ASP in considering all of these issues. So timing is certainly important. I think election years certainly get very difficult. I think even the year after an election, the politics is still there because you have the memory of the election is very fresh for states that succeeded in their nominations, and for those who didn't. I think those factors sort of flow on, but certainly timing is really important. And I think the point was well made that with respect to the recommendations related to the national nomination procedures in advance of the next elections, it's really important for that work to get underway and to be completed as far as possible in the early parts of 2022 in order that they can be implemented in advance of the nomination procedure for that election opening up in January 2023. So that's all I wanted to say for now, but just to thank everyone for the excellent presentations.
Thank you, Luke. And before to give the floor to Justice Goldstone, I was wondering whether Ambassador Marti would like also to comment and other comments. If I can say one thing, it is that the issue of conflict of interest is very important to us in civil society. And there is a reflection that has not been done appropriately. I had the possibility to witness, Luke, some of your New York working group meetings before the pandemic times, and I was quite shocked that this consideration, this aspect was not really considered as a crucial one. To be honest with you, the Rome Statute has to be interpreted much more restrictively. Of course, the minimum requirement is that a judge to be nominated to the ICC and elected should be eligible to the highest judicial office in a country. But this should be understood as a judicial office that will determine whether a person is guilty or not guilty for a serious crime. Therefore, a person coming from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, even in a fantastic legal capacity as one of the top lawyers in the world, cannot then make the step into the criminal chamber of the Supreme Court of a given country. Maybe he can make it to the highest administrative court because he learned a lot about the law of dealing with interagency issues. So there is a problem there. And with all the enormous respect that we have for the founding fathers of the Rome Statute, like Ambassador Philip Kirsch or the late Judge Hans-Peter Kaul, I'm mentioning really the persons without whom we wouldn't have the statute as good as it is. But were they really persons independent from the government that they served until the day they became a judge? They moved from the executive branch to the judicial branch by way of flash. So at that time, nobody posed the questions. But I think now, after 20 years, so at that time, I don't think we should go back and look at criticize the past with the lens of the present and of the future. But I think the time has come for states to put a stop to this practice of sliding doors and put an halt to their temptation to put their own best lawyers into the court. The court is a criminal court dealing with individual criminal responsibility. So we need absolutely independent individuals. Those who have put a number of years between their years of service with the government and they have served the judiciary, or they've served an academic institution or in an individual capacity under the List B requirements. So apologies if I took the freedom as a chair to add this comment, but I represent an organization of members of parliament, and we look very, very carefully into conflict of interest issues. We have to abide to so many ethics rules in PGA that we really know what we are talking about. And our members are really shocked when they see that certain officials from their executive, they become judges. They don't understand how is that possible. Justice Goldstone, may I give you the floor for your comments?
Yes, thank you very much indeed. Well, it's been a very wide-ranging and very rich and full discussion of some of the important issues relating to the nomination of judges for the ICC. I just want to make, and obviously one can't comment on all of them. I just want to make three short comments. Two relate to the issues raised by Ambassador Marti. Transparency. I think that really, as I think you also commented, is crucial. I think it's transparency that will keep states parties working as they should work. If they can work successfully behind closed doors, some of them are going to take advantage of that. And I think transparency is certainly the best weapon to ensure compliance with the provisions of the Rome Statute. I should have mentioned before my original remarks that obviously my remarks and my presence here at the side event or in my personal capacity, the IER no longer exists. Its mandate and its existence came to an end when it filed its final report in September 2009. Having said that, the second issue raised by Ambassador Marti, which is really crucially important and wasn't raised in the IER report, and that was the maximum age for nominees. As I understand the Swiss approach, no nominee should be considered if they are over the age of 59. This is a recommendation, interestingly enough, that was made by a committee that I headed. I think it was in 2008. It was set up by the CICC to look into the to the nominations for it was either the 2009 elections. The CICC set up this committee because there was then no advisory committee on nominations, and the CICC was concerned because some of the people nominated were clearly not qualified. One had no contact with the law at all. It was a former foreign minister who thought this would be a good retirement job to be a judge of the ICC. And one of the recommendations we made was that there should be an advisory committee on nominations, and the ASP accepted our recommendation, and that gave birth to the advisory committee. But one of our other recommendations was exactly that referred to by Ambassador Marti, that 59 should be the maximum age for nominees. And if the CICC can lay its hands on that report, I'm not sure that it's still on the web, but we attached as an annex to that report the retiring ages required by every single state's party. And there wasn't one without a retiring age, and the retiring age varied between 65 and 75. But 75 was the maximum. And yet it was some of those parties who nominated people, sometimes in their 70s, to become judges of the ICC. So that's, I think, a very important issue that indeed should be taken up by the ASP. Briefly, in answer to Liz Evenson, Liz, as I understood your question, you're really asking for my observations generally with regard to the responses to the IER report. Well, let me say I've got very positive views. Firstly, I'd say something which is often overlooked, and that is the very process of the review had a very beneficial effect even before the report was published, even before we began interviews and during the interview. Changes were already made ahead of our recommendation in the three major organs of the court, and particularly in the judges' chambers and the OTP. So the very process had a very positive result. But secondly, as I referred in my opening remarks, the review mechanism has really taken its work very seriously, and that emerges very clearly from the report. It's published, where every single one of the recommendations is referred to. I must say it's beyond the personal expectations that I had. So I think it's been a very successful process, and I'm sure that the ICC will be a lot stronger for it in the coming years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Justice Goldstone, and we are so delighted that you agreed to join two side events that we organized this week. So we are very proud of having been with you this week. And as you know, NGOs have been somehow a bit critical of some of the recommendations, but not because of the content of the recommendation, but especially because of the risk that we found that some states try to use only some of the recommendations for certain purposes of interfering with the independence of the court, especially the office of the prosecutor. Allow me to thank everyone who attended today. This session will be recorded, so I don't know if the chairman of the New York Working Group will want to maybe invite his colleagues one day in early 2022 to have a look at what we have discussed today. Maybe not. It's. I also wanted to point out that this is really a process, and the main success would be whether in 2023 the list of the nominees will be much longer than in the past, and such a list would attract a lot of applauses, a lot of appraisals from experts, civil society, independent observers of the workings of the international community. The ICC has an enormous task to be accomplished, and it is also really a great measure of solace for us to notice that some states like Switzerland, like Liechtenstein, like New Zealand are so engaged. So thank you so much for having been with us, and especially a special thank you for the colleagues of civil society and the new chairperson of the Trust Fund for the Victims, who just elected as first meeting that she attended after a successful ASP decided to join us from Santo Domingo. Thank you so much, and let's remain in touch because we have a very intense year of work. Bye-bye.